All right, I think the virtual room is starting to fill up nicely. So to use our time best, let's kick things off. Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you today to this webinar by the Co-Create project. My name is Matthias Honegger. I'm with Perspectives Climate Research, and I will be guiding us through this webinar today. I'll say a few words on the agenda. After me, we will hear from Dusan Chrenek from the Commission, a few introductory remarks on where we're at on this issue, what the current discussions are. This will be followed by some very short, very concise inputs from the project team, as you can see, on a range of issues as we approach this rather complex challenge, and I'll say a bit more what that challenge actually is. And after that, we'll open for discussion. So we're here really to learn from one another, to explore this issue through your different perspectives as well. As you're attending this, we hope to hear from many of you actively in the discussion. And then we'll close around 11:15. Also, perhaps to say this already, this is not the last opportunity to engage on these questions, but rather the first in many ways, especially when it comes to our upcoming work over the next few months on guidelines and principles. Okay, next slide, please. I want to just share this reflection because it's such a new point here. And just to say, there is this report from Germany just a few days ago that just really brings home the urgency of where we're at. The German Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, said it really unambiguously in her foreword to that report on climate risk assessment, that the consequences of climate change are already felt all over the world. And this may very well be the biggest security challenge of our time. So this is, on the next slide, please. This is really the backdrop to why we are even having this conversation. So conversation on solar radiation modification, SRM, is only because of this urgency. And now, some of you may not be super familiar. So the way I usually introduce this topic is to say, if you look at the satellite image here, you can see darker surfaces and brighter surfaces. The darker ones clearly absorb more energy. You know this, if you touch a black car in the summer, you will burn your fingers, whereas if it's a white car, it's much less hot. And that's the fundamental idea of solar radiation modification, is humanity could take a decision to potentially cool the planet or regions to counteract the warming trend or the heating trend. What's more, the European Environment Agency has also said this. Europe is not prepared for the coming threats. And therefore, there is this growing interest in this topic, even though it seems so outlandish, so crazy. There's interest in public discussion, but also among private actors. And the IPCC really, I mean, so far, the most important source of information on these sort of questions really says, I mean, in principle, theoretically, this would work to cool and to counteract several climate impacts, but deployment holds severe risks very clearly. And there is very limited confidence at the moment as to especially the regional climate impacts. So that by way of backdrop, on the next slide, just very briefly on what the project was asked to do. So you have this context as well. So the Co-Create project was asked essentially to explore the conditions and a possible governance framework for experimental research on SRM. And that's obviously an interesting point, because why would we focus on experimental research? Well, for one, it's the more challenging question. It's the more visible approach to research, and we've seen already a lot of modeling work done, computer simulations. But at some point, arguably, this only brings you so far without the reality check of environmental research in the field. And so then the question is whether and how the governance of that work could happen. And we are also asked to contribute to a better understanding of the risks and the conditions that would influence stakeholders' desirability viewpoints on this issue. And all of the above, very importantly, does not hold any prejudice as to its potential use in policy choices or in regulation. So our work is to structure and provide input into what will ultimately be a policy question. There's no question. This is not our task to predetermine policy, but rather to inform it, and we'll do our very best to do that. All right, next question. And with this, I will welcome Dusan to say a few words from his side.
Thanks, Matthias. Good morning to everybody. I'm really glad that I can participate at your webinar and also to learn how you are advancing in your project. That's for us very important. And really, the interest in solar radiation modification is growing. But we know that there is a knowledge gap that was assessed by several institutions, international organizations, and also IPC highlighted that we need to fill a knowledge gap and we need to have research. So really, this controversial issue deserves studying more, better assessment, and also research in this area. But we need responsible research addressing all risk, possible negative impacts of research. So we need to have clear rules, governance system. When I'm looking at the solar radiation modification, we need to have a global picture in which environment we are now. And according to Copernicus Climate Change Service, the last year was the warmest year on the record. The temperature was 1.6 degrees Celsius higher than pre-industrial period. And we have also like last 10 years were the warmest on the record. And Europe is warming even faster. At the same time, we need to look at tipping points, Earth system tipping points, and their possible cascading effects. Recently, also due to the cleaning of shipping fuels, actually with many positive effects on health. At the same time, they contributed, as several studies suggest, they contributed to the global warming. So we need to pay attention to solar radiation modification and to address all risk, negative impacts, but also opportunities. When we studied SRM almost 2 years ago in framework of the preparation of our joint communication with the High Representative for Foreign Policy on climate and security nexus, we identified SRM as a risk and really looking at the different risk, possible impacts and unintended consequences. It was clear that this controversial technology represents a risk for climate and security. In order to address this risk, in the joint communication, we committed to contribute to international efforts to address this risk, but also at the same time also to promote discussions on possible governance of possible deployment and also governance of research. And exactly on this point, your work is extremely important. In order to have better assessment, the Commission asked the group of chief scientific advisors to study this issue and to provide recommendations how to address risk and opportunities related to SRM. Because this is not only technical issue, but it has many ethical, political, social aspects. We ask also the European Group on Ethics to provide recommendations on ethical aspects on SRM. Both groups presented their recommendations last December, together with expert review, evidence review report, and together these recommendations and evidence review report, they help us to fill the knowledge, the lack of knowledge, and they provide also extremely useful insights for formation of our policies. DG Klima appreciated also the balanced view that both groups, they took into consideration broader aspects of European policies, not only in area of climate change, but in other areas from social perspective, environment perspective in general. And this broad reviewed report helps us to formulate our policies. One of the main recommendations focus on research, on the need to have responsible research that it's done with scientific rigor and also in line with European ethical principles in the research. So, and your work in this area is crucial. So I'm looking forward to hear how you are advancing and your ideas in this area. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dusan, for these helpful context remarks. We will now move immediately to the lightning talks, and those will cover first the question, what different types of field research are we even talking about, so that we have a clearer sense what the object is. Then we will hear about research ethics aspects. Some of the points addressed by Dusan will be showing up there, as I suspect, as well. And then we'll hear about a mapping of legal aspects that was already done and that is going to be expanded upon. And then finally, we'll start delving into the question of what guidelines and what principles. So I'll ask each speaker to just hand over to the next one so that we keep time in check. And with that, over to Ben on the field experiment mapping.
Thank you, Matthias. Yes, good morning, everyone. So today I want to briefly explore the range of solar radiation modification, or SRM, experiments that might require a governance framework. So recently we hosted a workshop at UCL, bringing together the leading SRM experts to discuss how research is moving from theory to practice and what kinds of field experiments would be useful to advance SRM. And so as experimentation progresses, it is clear that the governance will be key at each stage. Next slide, please. So these SRM field tests involving stratospheric aerosol injection, SAI, these circles in blue, marine cloud brightening, MCB, the pentagons in green, and cirrus cloud thinning, CCT, the yellow squares, have increased in number from 1 or 2 experiments in 2008 to 5 experiments in 2024, and these are likely to increase in the future. While these experiments are crucial for advancing our understanding of SRM, they also highlight the urgent need for governance. In the absence of regulation, which we currently have, private entities such as Satan and private companies such as Make Sunsets and the Stardust Initiative have already begun conducting outdoor experiments. And these outdoor experiments, they have little oversight. And so without governance, we risk a fragmented landscape developing where commercial actors and individual researchers shape the field without broader international cooperation. Next slide, please. SRM experiments, they vary widely in their purpose, scale, and complexity. Some will test the feasibility of a technique, while others will assess the climate impacts. However, defining experiments as small, medium, or large scale is often subjective and contentious. And so to provide clarity, we therefore use a 3-stage traffic light system, which you can see here, of near-term, mid-term, and long-term experiments, which are distinguished by scale, cost, governance requirements, and built-in exit ramps to pause, adapt, or halt research if risks become too great. Next slide, please. Near-term experiments, costing up to $10 million, these will focus on small-scale testing, often releasing tens to hundreds of kilograms of material. And these experiments aim to develop key technologies, such as nozzle systems for aerosol delivery, and to verify initial microphysical behavior models, so that we could better understand how particles actually interact and behave in the atmosphere. While these experiments are relatively low in impact, they still raise important governance questions. For instance, stakeholder engagement plays a key role in ensuring public trust and avoiding unnecessary controversy. Similarly, transparency can help address concerns before they escalate. Without clear communication, even small-scale research may attract scrutiny. Additionally, existing legal frameworks may be relevant, but their applicability to SRM remains an open question. And this highlights the need for further discussions on how such frameworks interact with emerging climate interventions. Next slide, please. So we move on to midterm experiments, which cost roughly $10 to $100 million or so. And so these scale up to releasing 1 ton or more of material. And these test injections effects over longer periods of time. These move beyond the initial feasibility studies and will help to provide real-world data on atmospheric impacts, and they will help to refine climate models and assess the potential effects on regional climate patterns. These tests may explore how SRM interacts with different environmental conditions and may help to shape future research directions and policy discussions. As experiments grow, of course, so do the governance challenges. So transparency and stakeholder engagement remain key, but new concerns emerge. Localized cooling or precipitation changes, even if temporary, may require environmental impact assessments and greater regulatory oversight. Next slide, please. And finally, long-term experiments, which will cost $100 million to $1 billion or more, are the final step before deployment-scale SRM. These experiments will release hundreds to thousands of tons in order to measure relative forcing effects and to validate global climate models. These findings will be critical in assessing whether SRM is feasible and worthwhile and may drive future governance decisions. At this stage, governance challenges intensify. Transboundary effects are unavoidable. These will raise questions of international oversight, liability, and geopolitical risks. Environmental impact assessments are no longer optional, and multilateral governance is essential. Certain questions also arise, such as 1, who are stakeholders? 2, how can governments be coordinated across nations? And 3, who has the authority to approve or halt these tests? Without clear governance, large-scale and sustained testing could fuel policy disputes and geopolitical tensions that extend far beyond science. Next slide, please. So the key takeaways from these short-term, midterm, and long-term experiments are that SRM experiments, they're progressing through these stages, and each of these stages will raise distinct governance challenges. At the early stages, the focus is on transparency and stakeholder engagement, while large-scale tests will introduce environmental risks, legal oversight, and fundamental requirements for international coordination. And there are several sort of key governance questions which are raised from these 3 stages of testing. Number 1 being, who are the key stakeholders and how should they be involved? Number 2 being, what governance mechanisms are needed at each stage? Number 3 being, how can multilateral oversight be established before large-scale testing? And finally, what exit ramps should be in place to pause, adapt, or halt experiments if the risks increase? And with that, I want to say thank you and pass over to Professor Dominic Lenzi, who will speak about SRM research ethics.
Hey, Ben. So yes, I'm going to give a brief overview of some of the developments with respect to SRM research and governance in the documents actually that Dusan already introduced for us, as well as one other. So next slide, please. So as we see in this figure from the AGU report recently, there's obviously quite a history with respect to this question, the governance of SRM research and potential deployment. If you look at the bottom of the figure, in the last 2 years, there's an increase in attention to this topic that's quite evident. Next slide, please. Or if you just click. Yes, so these are the 3 recent European Union reports on this topic that are not included in the slide. So the most important being perhaps the light blue one, which is from the group of chief scientific advisors. Now, I'm going to contrast some of the common ground and also potential tensions in some of these recent contributions. So speaking about the European Group on Ethics report, the Chief Scientific Advisor report, and the AGU report from just a little bit beforehand. Next slide, please. So this is an attempt to present a lot of material quickly, so apologies for that. What we've tried to do here is really boil down some key common ground that we see across these very large and complex reports, as well as some interesting points of difference and divergence. And I won't be able to go into much detail on these points today, but we could maybe come back to them in plenary if people have specific questions. So on the topic of governance, we see the chief scientific advisors, the EGE and the AGE, all emphasizing the need for international oversight and regulation, but some different requirements coming out of that. So with the GCSA, there's a call for a moratorium on use, but a permitting scheme for limited outdoor experimentation. The expert group on ethics speaks about participatory processes being involved in setting the scope of research, including when research should stop, while the AGU emphasizes enhanced transparency and procedural inclusion in the research process as a means of governance. On the involvement of publics and stakeholders, which follows directly from this last point, all of these documents really emphasize the need for inclusivity, inclusive participation. Quite what that means, again, can look a bit different, and that's maybe one of the things we can discuss afterwards. So with the GCSA, we have a call for citizen assemblies across the EU to debate SRM and also to foster transparency and governance. The EGE actually calls for an enhanced version of such deliberation where future generations and non-humans are somehow represented as well. The AGU instead emphasizes vulnerable groups and in particular indigenous groups as relevant stakeholders here. On ethics and responsibility, so the documents that we've been reviewing are pretty well unanimous that ethics review needs to be expanded to deal with the special nature of SRM risks, that this should be a broad look at SRM risks, not merely physical or technical. Now, the GCSA says that, as I just mentioned, all direct and indirect effects must be considered along with conformity to existing EU ethics principles that govern research. The EGE, the expert group on ethics, highlights the need for normative legitimacy in research, as well as emphasizing precautionary approaches. The AGU calls for transdisciplinarity on this point, actually. So the inclusion of ethics, expertise, social science within research projects to act as a kind of layer of governance there. On transparency, all of the documents call for open data, some differing proposals, but seeming complementarity actually here, calling for transparency of research funding and results, for transparency in the choices that determine modeled scenarios, the setting up also of international registries to monitor research done on this topic. Finally, on limitations of research. So again, there's a lot of emphasis here on strict oversight and regulation of outdoor research, large-scale research, these being also kind of difficult to define, as Ben was just mentioning. So as I said, the GCSA allows some limited outdoor experimentation, allows for the possibility of it anyway. The EGE emphasizes the liability that researchers would have when conducting such experiments. So this is quite a different perspective, I think, and highlights also, we could say, limitations of scientific freedom with respect to responsibilities to society. So this kind of responsible research and innovation idea. And the AGU instead doesn't make a clear distinction between indoor and outdoor research. So the implication being that these should be treated similarly. Next slide, please. So just to summarize what I've been saying, I think all of these documents are calling for significant expansions in the research ethics process and the inclusion of diverse publics. But as I was saying, there's a lack of clarity in some respects about who these publics or stakeholders must be. And very importantly, I think the role that these would play in the research process. So would they be somehow overseeing, or would they be directly involved in research projects? Would they be parallel to them? And of course, questions of representation. So who ought to be represented directly in these kinds of processes? There are also questions about ethics review criteria. So the GCSA has one of these that's particularly interesting, but there's several in these documents that we could talk about. For example, saying that funding should clearly support the EU's position in international negotiations with respect to SRM governance. So something like this could be a clear criterion for funding decisions, but this is just, I guess, a first step. So I'll leave it there and pass directly over to Julie, who's going to talk through the legal aspects.
Thanks, Dominic, and good morning, everyone. Julie Vinders from Trilateral Research. I'll give you a brief overview of some of the legal and regulatory mapping that we've been doing so far and what we've got ahead of us in terms of a more in-depth legal analysis that we are conducting this year. Next slide, please. So yeah, when it comes to scoping legal issues or legal considerations when it comes to research, something that's important to realize and perhaps obvious is that there are many existing norms, legal frameworks, principles that are applicable and relevant to SRM. It's an indication that it's not an ungoverned area, yeah, many legal frameworks will be applicable to SRM research. So what we've been doing in the first year of the Co-Create project is that we've gone through an exercise of identifying different types of legal issues and sort of mapped the associated legal frameworks that will be essentially the basis of the more in-depth legal analysis that we are conducting in the project and starting now. So we've published a scoping paper on those legal issues and relevant legal frameworks. Next slide, please. So when we identified these legal issues, we essentially asked, sort of had a category of questions along the lines of what, who, how, and where SRM research might take place to identify the relevant legal issues. So on the what side, it's looking at the intent of the proposed research, but also the effect and the scale, the type of research, and questions around whether something is a research experiment or could be classed as SRM deployment, and things like what materials or chemicals might be used, which has an impact on the types of pollution regulation or chemicals regulation that would be applicable. On the who side, we've asked questions of, well, who might be conducting the research, but also who might be affected by it, who controls or governs the activity, who funds it, who owns the rights and material interests arising out of the research, and who might be responsible or liable in the event of harm. So triggering rules related to state responsibility and liability, for example. On the how side, we're looking at how might SRM research be conducted, so the degree of transparency and the level of consultation that might be required, as well as the level of risk involved with the type of research experiment that might take place. And I'm aware what's important to consider is that different legal frameworks might apply to land-based, air-based, water-based, ice-based, space-based types of activities. These might take place within the national territory or beyond or in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So triggering different legal frameworks there, such as international waters or Antarctica Treaty system or even space law. So that's on the side of where an activity might take place, but then it's also obviously relevant to consider any transboundary impacts which might trigger other national laws as well as international legal frameworks. Next slide, please. So what we've then essentially been mapping and scoping is these different legal dimensions. So the legal frameworks that we'll be looking into for the more in-depth legal analysis is fundamental rights and human rights law, indigenous rights law, environmental law, which in itself contains a lot of different areas of environmental law and relevant legal principles, climate change laws, relevance, outer space law, law of the seas, polar law, including Antarctica Treaty System and the Arctic, intellectual property law, and rules on responsibility and liability. And within those legal frameworks, there are substantive rules, so related to rights and obligations, procedural rules, various different legal principles, such as the precautionary principle or the no harm rule. And then there are often rules specific to research activities. So some distinction is being made there in the sense of, it being an SRM research activity as opposed to SRM deployment, for example. And in terms of governance levels, these frameworks span across all levels of governance, essentially international, national, and EU. But for the in-depth legal analysis, we will be focusing on EU law and Europe, as the focus will be on European research area. We'll take EU law as a starting point and then look at international law where relevant and national law, particularly in the sense of liability and intellectual property, which is mostly governed at the national level. Next slide, please. So just to give you a bit of a flavor of the sort of overarching considerations that we've identified in the context of SRM research in particular, is the fact that there's some ambiguities and perhaps conflicts among definitions. So what constitutes SRM research versus other types of research, or what constitutes SRM research versus SRM deployments, for example, and is there a clear distinction? Also the interpretation of existing laws and principles. So whilst there are a lot of existing principles that are relevant and applicable, how do we interpret them in the context of SRM? So the precautionary principle is a key one here, as well as the no harm rule. So what is the clear precautionary path when it comes to implementing SRM or not? Third, the limitations and suitability of existing legal frameworks. So whilst we have existing frameworks, are they actually fit for purpose? Because they're probably not designed with SRM in mind. So are there any gaps that might need to be addressed? Also the adequacy of governance mechanisms. So what is the correct or the most appropriate forum or political forum to develop a governance framework for SRM research. And finally, how to navigate the tension between the risks of climate change on the one hand and the risks of SRM. So how to frame that risk context from a legal perspective. So we'll be diving into a more in-depth legal analysis this year, looking into some of these overarching considerations. Thanks very much, and I'll hand back over to Matthias.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Yeah, so we just heard some of the ongoing work, some of the ongoing reflections and observations on the differences between different field experiment types, the research ethics landscape, really helpful overview there, I thought, and then the legal and regulatory landscape, which is still also to be expanded upon. So I'd like us to take a look now forward to an area where our work is really only beginning, and actually our engagement here today is really going to be informative for our thinking going forward, and that is on the guidelines and principles. Oh yeah, there we go. And here, primarily, what we seek to address again is this question: under which conditions and governance arrangements would field research on SRM be desirable from the viewpoints of a range of stakeholders, including towards reducing uncertainties and also perhaps indirectly lowering the probability of problematic outcomes, such as unilateral deployment or large-scale testing elsewhere. So by engaging responsibly, is there a chance that the EU can help avoid those problematic outcomes, including elsewhere? So the link between conditions, research types, and their desirability is really what's in focus here. Now, what we try to do here is going to be to unpack this a little bit, and I think the dimension also that Dominic showed were helpful in that regard. Some of what I'm showing here is going to overlap in different ways, I think, and I'll dive deeper into some technical aspects. So first, this broad notion is the relationship with publics there, and is it appropriate? What is the legal situation? What is the ethical situation in sort of research ethic terms, but perhaps even broader than that? And then the more technical question perhaps is about scientific merit. So where is there a desirability based on the types of answer, the types of approaches that are being put forward? And there are several sub-elements to that, perhaps to unpack. And finally, of course, the risk associated with specific types of experiments or research overall. Now, on the scientific merit, as alluded to, this is where perhaps the broad context comes in, the context also of climate change impacts, where scientific merit may be made up of at least two components, namely, what do we learn about to reduce the uncertainties of SRM's potential effectiveness in the future? That's one side, effectiveness being in terms of reducing climate change impacts. And the other, and perhaps just as or even more important, is what does any particular piece of research help us learn, better understand the risks of such hypothetical SRM use? So definitely there are those two, and they're almost not disentangleable, but they're both there as, a key question, what is the merit of any particular type of research? And there's other dimensions to it, I would venture, but just to make that very explicit, we also have this notion that studying the risks of SRM use will put us in a better place potentially with regard to the risk of undesirable outcomes through the threat of, for example, unilateral or uncoordinated large-scale testing or use. Now, as we move towards principles, it's clear that this is about norms in a very broad sense. And so to make it explicit where we draw from in our work, already through the previous presentations, you get a sense of this. We look at the international discussion on specifically SRM and SRM research, what has been discussed so far in terms of relevant principles and norms. Then we take a hard look at the EU value landscape, if you will. So what EU instruments, processes, current requirements already express in terms of values and priorities from a European viewpoint. And then we, of course, also need to study the latest knowledge on climate change and SRM, so the scientific perspective. And finally, what we already do today in part is this engagement with stakeholders to refine our thinking and find blind spots. So all of those four corners contribute to our process of identifying principles and the normative underpinnings that should guide this work. Now, there's an added question, especially when it comes to guidelines. What should those guidelines do? What purpose should they serve? And there's a lot of elements to that, and this is a preliminary sort of outline of some of the elements that did come to mind as we were preparing here. And for example, guidelines could serve to help inform approval processes when it comes to the risks of field experiments. For example, as they have potential for harm, we want to understand what that potential is. Advisory mechanisms, so how to shape those potential consultations of experts, publics, etc. Also with regard to long-term concerns, intergenerational aspects for those that don't have a voice yet. And then what value for informing policymaking, value of insights for the medium and long term, and the short term, of course, but perhaps that the longer term is sometimes more overlooked. Linked to that, perhaps, is the question of how does a research case intertwine with current research priorities? How does it contribute to research gaps, thematic research agendas, for example, perhaps also towards this emerging climate threat, security issues, etc. And linked with that in some ways is the question, is there perhaps a value toward desired capabilities that needs to be examined, such as, the capability to detect rogue experiments done elsewhere. That is a separate question in some ways, and nonetheless an important one. And finally, the overarching sort of evaluation approach to the question of scientific merit overall, including upsides and downsides of different types of research, both on the individual research level and at the level of entire categories. As we started to look into these different norms, this normative landscape, if you will, it became clear quite quickly that it's going to be an inevitable fact that there are tensions between different normative directions, different hopes, different expectations, if you will. One example is the concern of the political or social effect from doing research onto climate change mitigation efforts or onto the risk of potentially dangerous use, where there is a fear, of course, that research leads to dangerous use. And that is in tension, again, with this notion that perhaps by engaging responsibly, one may have a handle on reducing the probability of problematic efforts overall. So if that would be the rationale, if the EU is involved in this work proactively and responsibly, there is a chance to help shape the broader landscape of developments. And as noted, there is already private interest in this issue. Now, similarly, if you look at the word cloud, which is the result of a first brainstorming work, you can see there, again, those different norms, different expectations of principles, sometimes formalized, sometimes informal. And I think everyone has a different read on those. And what our aspiration is here to bring some structure into this to show where those tensions might be, but also how those different principles may apply alongside one another. And through that structuring, hopefully help inform those ultimately policy deliberations and decisions. So with that, and actually within that spirit of opening this to the discussion, I would just like to say a few words on how we want to engage here. Some of you have already used the Q&A chat, so we will consider those questions. Many of you probably have quick thoughts already, comments that you want to make or questions. And just to say, like, for this process of co-creation, we'd like you to actively listen to each other. We want to have the time to engage on different views. That said, we also need everyone to be concise and clear, stay on topic, and build on each other's view where possible, encouraging different perspectives and channeling kindness. I think these are basic rules of engagement that help us really venture into this co-creative process. There's a few guiding questions that may perhaps also help you find your voice here, but we don't need to stick to those. We welcome your questions and comments going forward, and we'll see. We'll go by also hands being raised in order to structure this. I saw one question already in the Q&A. Should we address this one? I think, Ben, you gave an answer, but perhaps the person who put it there might want to raise the question verbally as well. I see a hand from Sam Kaufman. Do you want to go ahead?
Hi, thank you all for a great panel. I have been following a lot of the US and European discussions of this type recently, and in each I see I have a significant concern which I do not see addressed, which I thought might be worth raising here, which is, I guess I'll call it perverse governance. In the democracies of the world, it is easier to pollute than to research, given the same perturbation. So an emission of aerosols, for example, which is extremely relevant to SRM research, is easier to do if it is a negative output of some industry than it is if it is research. This is an in-practice effect of, I suppose, the presently existing research governance structure. So I'm hopeful that, I don't, I'm not a research governance expert, but I'm hopeful that research governance for SRM that is developed can kind of reverse that perversity. It should be easier to emit any given pollutant or environmental emission for science than it should be for pollution or for private gain. I think we see that, given that academic experiments are more likely to get shut down than private companies, we see this perversity playing out in practice, and I suspect it will continue to play out in practice unless research governance can correct it.
Yeah, thank you indeed. Yes, a very interesting point indeed. So to me, it speaks to the need for taking the big picture into account, really, and have that understanding of orders of magnitude, of scales. I did see now the question that was asked and answered in the chat. I don't know if it once should be addressed in public, from Susanne Bauer asking, none of the current experiments seem to come from the EU. Are there any technical experiments or projects being planned, including from commercial actors? I don't know if anyone from our team or even anyone else would have a clear answer. I see Ben tentatively answered. Ben, do you want to address it?
Yeah, sure. So it's a good question, and as I've sort of alluded to in my answer, that there is some ongoing experiments, but from researchers with the Cloud Lab project in Switzerland, and I'm sure the people on this call associated with that would be happy to talk more about that. But yeah, they're the two cancelled experiments with SPICE and SCOPEX, which occurred within Europe, but to my knowledge, and Matthias, you're probably the best place to say more about this, but to my knowledge, I don't know of any EU-specific planned projects. But yeah, the of interest that the nearest commercial actors would be Stardust in Israel. But yeah, I'm not aware of any upcoming experiments. It's difficult with these things because sometimes things are planned, but you just don't know about them. So maybe there is, but sorry, I don't know more.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, no, I don't really have anything to add on that, to be honest. It is an open question, I think, what's happening next. So I see Nazli, did you have a question or a comment?
The first question is related to the environmental impact. So it was about so in the presentation delivered by Ben, he was saying that the I think he phrased it as long-term experiments will only have minor environmental impacts, but like the existing literature, the prevailing view suggests that long-term experiments will have major environmental impacts. So it would be great if he can explain why he thinks these environmental impacts will be minor.
Yeah, sure. It's a really good question. And so what I'm trying to sort of make clear is that these long-term experiments, these aren't necessarily extending for a long period of time or prevailing for a long period of time. This is what we're trying to say here, is that these are large-scale experiments which will be the ones we get to in the future, having gone through the near-term experiments, then we've done the mid-term experiments, and then these will be furthest in the future that we'll do these long-term experiments. So they're long-term in that sense. So yeah, if you're going to release sort of much larger amounts of material, so for example, for SAI, you might release hundreds to thousands of tons of material. This is still very, very, it's a small amount relative to the amount of SO2 which is being released every day. It's a very small amount. And so with that in mind, it's that there are going to realistically be small amounts, the environmental changes, the climatic changes are going to be small for something like that, because it's a drop in the ocean relative to the amount going up anyway. And it's the same regarding marine cloud brightening and cirrus cloud thinning. The amounts of material being released is so small, and the fact that it wouldn't be sustained, but it would be released in a sort of, it would be for a small period of time, not for extended periods. So in that sense, it would not be a large effect environmentally or climatically. But if there were adverse effects, and why it's important to eventually do experiments at this scale, the adverse effects that would be identified would be really useful to sort of establish exit ramps so that we would know if there was ever going to be a deployment, what the potential negative effects might be. I hope that sort of clarifies that a bit.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so that speaks to the temporality, and I think you did a good job in explaining that different research types may actually answer specific questions. Of course, when it comes to the longer term effects, you would need to move more towards that large scale, also intertemporal large scale. Ever then there are different questions that this could answer versus those shorter term ones. There's also a question I see, or a point from Olivier in terms of the geographical scale, and afterwards we come to Axel. I think Olivier pointed out, that the sort of territorial approach to governance may be limited or inadequate. I don't know, Olivier, do you want to raise that point yourself?
Hello, thank you, Matthias. It was just a reaction to Susan's question and Ben's response yeah, what does territoriality mean? Is it territoriality of the actor? Where is he based, or territoriality of where the experiment is? And that's just a dimension that needs to be accounted for. But I don't have any opinion on how to do it.
Discussed. Yeah. Yeah, very good point indeed. Yeah. Yeah, and perhaps speaks to the international need for coordination as well between different elements of governance. Yes, Axel, please, and then after Shika.
Yeah, thank you. I have two comments, questions. The first one relates to what we currently see in the international policy sphere. So we see some rogue actors, authoritarian or semi-authoritarian heads of state who are just currently stunning the system. What Trump does in the US, I would compare with stunning, that just the action of the policymaker is so destructive when it comes to the system and is so rapid that the system doesn't have resilience. And I wondered how we, in now looking at the research governance, could factor in such resilience and also or reactivity. So is the research governance able to withstand such an attempt of being stunned by a political actor? So that's the first thing. And the second one relates to there was some discussion that the research should, or it was mentioned, research should support EU negotiation position. And that, of course, for me would be a bit weird. We as researchers, of course, usually are not meant to serve specific political processes. So I would have a personal issue if that would be a part of principle or even indicator or reason for research. So the research should be valid on its own and it's not just be politically driven. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Axel. I'll hand right away to Shika if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much. And hi, everyone. I'm sorry, my camera is not working, so unfortunately, I can't turn it on. But really interesting conversation, and especially all of the points and questions that have been raised. Almost in line with actually what has been mentioned in the last two interventions by Axel and Ben. I think this research and this research program in particular is much more political than most other research programs. And I think I actually am glad that there is a point of supporting negotiation strategy, through the course of this research when it comes to the EU, because the EU has usually taken an environment first and a proactive approach when it comes to protectionism against, further ill impacts or negative impacts. And it's been reiterated already that the research could be happening by a certain actor in a certain territory and have impacts much further away from that geographical boundary of the political state. So I think for me, the questions really that come up are if someone could actually go back to the sort of beginning and talk about what went wrong at UNEA and why certain countries blocked the kind of embargo that was being negotiated on this research. Because to reiterate, when we talk about long-term research programs, they're experiments that will have real-world impacts. It's not something that's contained in a lab or simulated. It is something that will have impacts in the real world. So if someone could allude to what went wrong there and how the politics there since has shifted. And the second part of it actually relates to Axel's point on this shock and, can this research actually help create a framework that allows resilience against those sort of experiments and shocks that can have impacts and will have impacts on other parts of the world and populations. And I back all of this also from a very important narrative that stands against SRM, which is to suggest that, it's not just science for the sake of science when it comes to SRM, because there's a lot of private sector interest in creating these kind of technologies that are going to have adverse effects in the short, medium, and long term, given that the political systems that we have currently are not keeping pace with the kind of climate action that we need. So it is research that is heavily motivated from creating technologies that are not equitable. And I think this research project needs to sort of respond to that sensibility as well. So I'll stop here and look forward to hearing from you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Shika. I'll just ask this way. Are there any takers on the question, what went wrong at UNEA? I have my thoughts, but it's obviously it's a challenging question. So if there's anyone volunteering for it, I'll hand it over. No? Well, I'll say it this way from my viewpoint, and I should say I was at the preceding UNEA negotiations in 2019, so I can judge based on that observation and based on the reports. I wasn't there last year. In some ways, the governments who convened weren't quite ready to address this issue. I think there was a bottom line agreement that dealing with it is eventually inevitable, and that dealing with it in a multilateral spirit is ultimately inevitable as well. But there wasn't sufficient readiness to address it. And there were many concerns that addressing it in one way or another would create a prejudice or a precedent as to the direction in which it was gonna go. So to me, it speaks for a need for more spaces for deliberation, more opportunities to engage, and to build a level of shared understanding and trust that there are shared interests in this at the global stage. And of course, the political dynamics at the moment don't help with this, but I think it speaks more to the need to take an effort in that direction, despite rather than in opposition to the current developments. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, and one can debate on this for long. By the way, we can also collect topics for deeper discussion if this is one that we should examine more deeply as it pertains to research governance. We will do that in upcoming seminars. So we gladly hear from you your suggestions on additional deeper dives that you want to explore jointly. Unless there's a follow-up on this, I saw a point from Olivier on space solutions, if you want to bring that up.
So space solutions, so that's referring to planetary sunshade, and that's something we looked at maybe 12 years ago. We asked some space experts, and basically they ruled it out as something unrealistic. So I erased it from my mind, but recently I've been talking to at least one actor on the topic, and I think it's maybe back in the race because there are a lot of the cost of putting things in orbit are dropping significantly. So it's still a very expensive solution, but not as expensive as it was maybe 10 years ago. So I was wondering, whether that's been considered and whether that fits in the framework that is being designed by Co-Create. So I've seen that you mentioned space as outspace law and things like that. But in a way, it could be a very expensive field experiment, but with relatively little risk and no transboundary physical consequences. There would still be geopolitical consequences, but it's a bit of a different animal. So I was wondering whether it's been thought through.
A short answer, I think, would be in a tangent. As you say, it's not been a centerpiece of discussion in recent years. This idea of having a space sunshade, if you will. But it is something that is somewhere part of our thinking. I don't know, Ben, if you want to say something about that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Initially, I hadn't considered it because I thought it was prohibitively expensive, estimates at $1 trillion kind of thing. But at Arctic Frontiers 2 weeks ago, I was presenting the research we've been doing with field tests, and there were actors there who were very strongly against any SRM, and they were proponents of saying that the only one they would ever support would be, space-based protections at Lagrange point 1. So maybe it is something which we should consider in these field test stuff, and particularly with modeling study, with certain studies saying that the costs of climate change will be the damages from climate change will be $38 trillion per year by 2050. So maybe it does become affordable, but I don't know who's stumping up that much cash to do a field experiment. But we should perhaps consider it more seriously now.
I view it as a bit of an X factor when compared to the sort of more mainstream discussion. It's something that could indeed arise down the road eventually quite swiftly if there is suddenly a major interest in it. But there's much less research done to date, as far as I can tell. So it's a bit more tricky to really grasp as an issue, which might mean that we need to pay more attention indeed. So who's next? John, is that you?
Yeah, just a little point on that space-based thing. I was at a meeting with about 30 billionaires in Switzerland earlier this week, and somebody gave a talk on the space-based thing, and it captured people's imagination like nothing else. And of course, this is not just regular people, but I think it offers this very kind of simplistic fix that people could latch on to. So yeah, considering the billionaires in the audience, I was pretty surprised by this, actually.
That's interesting. We'll need to talk more about that.
Interesting.
Raises all sorts of questions, obviously. Was there another? I see a bit of a back and forth. I don't know, Julie, did you want to give an answer, a late answer to one of these questions?
Oh yeah, so I'll just repeat the question for everyone. So let me find it again. It was to do with the distinction between climate change law and environmental law as two separate categories, as I laid out. I think that is more of an organizational issue in this sense. So within environmental law category, there's a lot of within that there's a lot of subcategories. So laws related to pollution regulation or chemicals regulation, waste regulation, environmental impact assessments. So I think that point from my perspective is more organizational, that we've separated climate change law out as a separate legal framework. But either way, we will be doing an in-depth analysis of those relevant laws. So I think that is more of an organizational point, unless there are other thoughts on that, I'd be happy to have any feedback on that. And the second question was to do with attribution of harm. So the challenge of essentially establishing causation between a particular research, SRM research activity that might increase the probability of something happening, and then environmental damage or harm sort of occurring, and existing liability regimes, requiring causation between the traditional liability regimes. Okay, this harm occurred. Can it be attributed to this activity to establish liability? And that might be particularly challenging in a context of SRM where it's increasing probabilities. So establishing a direct causal link might be challenging. So this is very much this question of, well, are existing liability regimes fit for purpose, or would it require some sort of strict liability framework? So those are things that we'll certainly be looking at within as we look at or do the analysis of liability laws and rules on state responsibility. It's also relevant for the no harm rule, so states' obligation to prevent harm and liability that might arise if damage occurs. But yeah, how do you establish that causal link? So we will be looking into those questions. I don't have any clear answer in that sense yet, but we will be considering it, and it is an issue to consider.
Thank you so much. Yeah, indeed. And there's obviously, in terms of attribution challenges, there's also a scientific counterpart to that legal question.
Yes.
So I suspect more conversations will need to happen at that interface. Axel, please.
Yeah, just a follow-up question on this space discussion, because I was a bit confused. Do participants here assume that space-based solutions are inherently less risky? Because I would expect that the impacts on the ground and on precipitation system whatsoever would also be relevant. Of course, the deployment of the technology as such may not have direct side effects, but the broader side effects, I would not see any structural difference. I'm not an expert in this, so I just want to get an idea how people think about that. Thank you.
Can we get just super quick reactions from Sam and Olivier? Really quick.
I agree with kind of questioning that assumption. One of the most important drivers of SRM impacts is whether you overcool the equator or overcool one hemisphere. Space-based SRM would not necessarily do or not do that. You have to look at, truth matters. You have to look at the evidence rather than just assuming based on kind of what it feels like.
Yeah, agreed. The risk on precipitation, overcooling, etc. remains. Is pretty much the same, maybe even worse because there is less free degrees of freedom in how you do this. But you don't have the stuff on your head, and when it comes to field experiments, that's been a major concern. So that major concern goes away. You don't have the particles where you live, basically. So it makes a difference for, I think, for the research on the field experiments, and maybe not so much for the deployment.
Okay, thanks. My takeaway then is it matters a great deal which risks we look at, and perhaps we take another look at our project plan to see if there's room to explore on that a bit more clearly. That's it. Dusan, I see your hand is up.
Thanks a lot. Maybe some general comments and comments on the questions. So on a question on UNEA, I didn't participate personally, but what was important for the EU that there was discussion on this global question, and we supported this discussion, and it's necessary to have it an international forum. And I think that UNEP a suitable forum, UNEA is a suitable forum. Unfortunately, discussion didn't lead to the final result. But again, the EU will support such discussions, and we need global framework, so international level to discuss it, and also to have science-based discussion. Together, there is question what was about science, research, if it should support policy making. Actually, for me, it's important not to do only research for research, but also to do research to support policy making. That's very important. There is also policy-driven research, and this framework co-create project is actually very helpful, and it could provide us valuable insight for international negotiations, but also for the developments of policies at the EU level. And for the research, for a moment, we are not planning to support any experiments or outdoor tests. What we would like to focus is more on modeling and detection capacity. And we would like to use more space technology, satellites also for that. So for a moment, we are working also with the European Space Agency, ESA is conducting studies in that direction. There are also other research projects on cloud aerosol interactions that could be useful also for this assessment, SRM research in general. But at the end, I would like to highlight co-create projects. It's important for us, and it provides important input for policy making. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dusan. Very helpful insights in where you're at. We are coming up to the end of today's seminar. I first of all really want to thank everyone for their very active and engaged participation. This is how we get to jointly develop these challenging issues and tentative answers on them. I want to mention a couple of things where the conversation can continue, and that is primarily the stakeholder forum. So if you sign up for the stakeholder forum, you will be first to hear news. You will be first to know venues for further discussion, including future seminars. And you're also welcome to reach out by any means available to suggest topics for discussion, different formats as part of this seminar series, or also for in-person gatherings. Speaking of which, we are hoping to convene a roundtable probably in June, early June, more details to follow. And also next year, we are headed towards a larger convening, a larger gathering, a conference in person in Brussels. Details still to be determined, but that will be another chance to really dive deeper. By then, we should have much more to concrete work to discuss and to hear your views on that. There's also a newsletter. In case you don't receive it yet, go to our website, sign up. Warmly recommend doing that. And we're here to learn from you, to engage with you. And in that spirit, I hope I'm not missing anything that should have been said. Actually, we will have the slides on the website, so you can take another look. Some additional details will be included. And again, thank you so much for participating. Thanks to the co-create team for the very strong involvement here from all sides. I wish you a very good day and a good weekend. Finally, the sun is out in Brussels. Enjoy. Thank you.